48. By this time, battle had also been joined on the Roman left, where the allied cavalry faced the Numidians. The fighting was sluggish at first, and commenced with a Carthaginian trick. Some 500 Numidians kept swords hidden under their corslets, in addition to their regular weapons and javelins. Pretending to desert, they rode over from their side, keeping their shields behind their backs. Swiftly dismounting and throwing down their shields and spears at the feet of the enemy, they were welcomed into the center of the Roman ranks, taken to the rear of the lines, and told to wait at the back. While the engagement got under way at all points, they remained there quietly. But after everyone's thoughts and eyes had become fixed on the battle, they seized shields that lay scattered there and there amongst the piles of corpses, and attacked the Roman line from behind. Hacking at the soldiers' backs and cutting their hamstrings, they caused enormous loss of life, and considerably more panic and confusion. In one spot men would be running off in terror, in another fighting on obstinately, when little hope now remained. Then Hasdrubal, commander in that quarter, withdrew the Numidians from the center of the line, since they were showing little spirit in fighting their opponents, and sent them in pursuit of the scattered fugitives. He now brought in the Spaniards and the Gauls to support the Africans, who by this time were well nigh exhausted, more from massacring their enemy than fighting them. In the other sector of the fighting, Paulus had been seriously wounded at the very start of the engagement by a projectile from a sling. Even so, he made frequent charges against Hannibal, his men in a compact body, and restored the battle at several points. Roman horsemen were giving him cover, but eventually these abandoned their mounts, for the consul was now losing the strength even to control his horse. Someone then brought word to Hannibal that the consul had ordered his cavalrymen to dismount, and he is reported to have said, "I should have preferred him to have handled them to me in irons." The cavalry were now on foot and fighting as if the enemy victory was no longer in doubt. Though defeated, they preferred to die where they stood rather than to flee, while the victors, furious at the men delaying their victory, massacred those they could not dislodge. They did, however, drive off a few survivors, exhausted from their efforts and their wounds. All the Romans then scattered, and those who could were chasing after their horses to make their escape. The military tribune, Gnaeus Lentulus, was riding by when his eyes fell on the consul, sitting on a rock and covered with blood. "Lucius Aemilius," he said, "on you alone the gods should look with favor, the one man free of blame for today's debacle. Take this horse while you still have some strength left. I shall be at your side. I can raise you up and protect you, so that you do not add tragedy to this battle with the death of a consul. Even without that there is enough to weep and grieve for." "God bless your courage, Gnaeus Cornelius," replied the consul, "but do not waste in useless pity the little time you have to escape the enemy's clutches. Go, take this official message to the Senate. They must see to the fortifications of the city of Rome, and secure them with troops before the victorious enemy arrives. But take Quintus Fabius aside, and tell him that Lucius Aemilius Paulus lived to this point and now dies, with his precepts in mind. For myself, let me breathe my last amidst my men, the victims of this massacre. Thus I can avoid standing trial again after my consulship, or coming forward as my colleague's accuser, to defend my innocence by blaming another. As they conversed, they were overtaken first by a crowd of their fellow citizens in flight, then by the enemy. The enemy, unaware of his identity, showered the consul with projectiles, and in the confusion Lentulus was whisked away to safety by his horse. With that, there was disordered flight in every quarter. 7,000 men made good their escape to the smaller camp, 10,000 to the larger. About 2,000 escaped to the actual village of Cannae, but they were immediately surrounded by Cartholo and his cavalry, since the town had no fortifications to protect it. Whether by accident or design, the other consul had joined none of these particular groups as of fugitives. He slipped away to Venusia with about 50 cavalrymen. Roman casualties were reported to have been 45,500 infantry and 2,700 cavalry, with numbers of citizens and allies being roughly the same. They included both quaestors of the consuls, Lucius Attilius and Lucius Furius Babaculus, as well as 29 military tribunes, some of whom were former consuls, praetors, and aediles. Numbered amongst these are Gnaeus Servilius Geminus and Marcus Minucius, who had been master of horse the year before and consul a number of years earlier. There were also 80 senators, or men who had held offices that qualified them for selection for the Senate. These had themselves chosen to serve as soldiers in the legions. 3,000 infantry and 1,500 cavalry were reportedly taken prisoner in the battle. '50. So went the battle of Cannae. Its fame rivals that of the disaster at the Elea, and while it was less critical in its outcome, since the enemy stalled thereafter, it was in losses even more serious and appalling. For while the rout at the Alea meant the loss of the city, it still saved the army. At Cannae, the fleeing consul had with him barely 50 men, and almost the entire army shared the fate of the other consul, who died there. In the two Roman camps there was now a poorly armed crowd of men without leaders. Those in the larger camp dispatched a message to the smaller asking their comrades to join them while the enemy, exhausted from the battle and from the jubilant feasting that would follow it, would be deep in sleep during the night. They would then leave for Canusium in a single column, they said. Some rejected the suggestion out of hand, asking why the men issuing the invitation could not come themselves, as that would be as good a way of their joining up. The reason was evident, these men said. The ground between them was all in enemy hands, and they preferred to put other people's safety at risk rather than their own. Others were not averse to the suggestion, but lacked the nerve to follow it. However, the military tribune, Publius Sempronius Tuditanus, declared, So you prefer to be taken by a greedy and ruthless foe, do you? To have a price set on your heads, and payment demanded by men who ask you if you are a Roman citizen or a Latin ally, humiliating and tormenting you to give another man some recognition? No, you do not prefer that, at least not if you are the fellow citizens of the consul Lucius Aemilius, who chose to die well rather than live in disgrace, and of all those courageous men who lie heaped about him. The enemy clamoring before our camp gates are in chaotic disorder. Let us break through them before dawn comes upon us, and their troops block our path in greater numbers. With the sword and pluck one can find a way through the thickest enemy line. And with a wedge formation you could scatter this sprawling and disorganized crowd as though nothing blocked your path. Go with me, then, those of you who want to save yourselves and the Republic. So saying, he drew his sword, formed up a wedge of men, and marched through the enemy's midst. The right flank was exposed, and at this the Numidians directed their javelins, but the men transferred their shields to their right side, and some 600 made good their passage to the larger camp. Then, joined by another large group, they came through directly to Canusium without losses. This was a feat brought off by conquered men, the result of a surge of courage that came from the character of each individual, or from pure chance. It was not planned by the men, or conducted under anyone's command. 51. All the Carthaginians were gathered around Hannibal, congratulating him on his victory and urging him, now that he had finished off this great war, to take what remained of the day and the oncoming night for rest, both for himself and for his exhausted men. Not so the cavalry commander Maharbal, who was of the opinion that they should not let up for a moment. No, said Maharbal. So you may realize the significance of this battle, you will be holding your victory dinner on the Capitol in 4 days. Follow behind me. I shall go ahead with the cavalry, so the Romans will know of our arrival before they are aware of our coming. To Hannibal the idea seemed too good to be true, too great for him to absorb immediately. He declared that, while he appreciated Maharbal's enthusiasm, he would need time to consider his suggestion. Then Maharbal quipped, "Yes, indeed, the gods do not give everything to the same man. You know how to win a battle, Hannibal. You do not know how to use the victory. That day's delay is generally believed to have been the salvation of the city and the empire." At first light the next day, the Carthaginians proceeded to gather the spoils and inspect the slaughter, which was a shocking sight even to the enemy. Romans, infantry, and cavalry lay in their thousands all over the field as the fighting, or their flight, happened to have brought them together. Some glory figures rose up from the midst of the carnage, when their wounds, smarting in the cool of the morning, roused them to consciousness, and they were cut down by the enemy. Some of the Carthaginians found lying there, alive, with thighs and knee tendons severed, exposing their necks and telling them to shed the last of their blood. Others were discovered with their heads buried in freshly dug earth. They had evidently made holes and suffocated themselves by covering their faces with the soil. What especially caught everybody's attention was a Numidian with a nose and ears torn off, who was pulled out alive from beneath a dead Roman who was lying on top of him. When the Roman found his hands no longer able to hold a weapon, his anger had turned to fury, and he had died while he was tearing his enemy apart with his teeth. 52. Hannibal spent most of the day gathering up the spoils. He had led an attack on the smaller camp, where he first of all constructed an earthwork that cut its occupants off from the river. In fact, the Romans were all fatigued from their efforts and sleeping deprivation as well as their wounds, and their capitulation came even sooner than Hannibal had expected. They negotiated an agreement whereby they surrendered their weapons and horses for a ransom price of 300 quadrigati per head for Romans, 200 for allies, and 100 for slaves. They would leave with one piece of clothing each once the payment was made. They then admitted the enemy into their camps and were all put under guard, citizens and allies, in their own separate groups. While time was being spent on this, some 4,000 infantrymen and 200 cavalrymen, those with the strength and nerve for the venture, left the larger camp and escaped to Canusium, some in a body, others randomly drifting through the fields, which proved no less safe an option. The camp itself was surrendered to the enemy on the same terms as the other, by the wounded and the faint-hearted who were left behind. The spoils accumulated were enormous. Apart from the horses, prisoners, and whatever silver there was, most of it in the form of trappings from horses, since the Romans used very little silverware at table at last on campaign, everything else was to be parceled out as plunder for the army. Hannibal then had the bodies of his men gathered together for burial, and these, it is said, represented some 8,000 of his finest soldiers. Some sources have it that the Roman consul was also sought out and accorded burial. Those who had escaped to Canusium were afforded only the shelter of the city walls and plain lodging by the townspeople. However, an Apulian woman called Buza, renowned for her nobility and wealth, also assisted them with gifts of grain, clothing, and money for traveling. Later, on the conclusion of the war, she was honored by the Senate for her generosity. 53. There were 4 military tribunes in Canusium. From the 1st Legion, Quintus Fabius Maximus, whose father had been dictator the previous year. From the 2nd Legion, Lucius Publicius Bibulus and Publius Cornelius Scipio. And from the 3rd, Appius Claudius Pulcher, who had recently been aedile. But by general agreement, supreme command was vested in Publius Scipio, who was just a young man, and in Appius Claudius. These were discussing with a few others how matters stood for the state when Publius Furius Philus, son of the former consul, announced that they were idly nourishing hopes that were lost. The republic was completely finished, as good as dead. Some young noblemen, with Lucius Caecilius Metellus at their head, were contemplating taking to the sea in ships, leaving Italy to seek asylum with one of the kings, he said. This terrible news was shocking in itself, but coming also as a fresh blow on top of all the disasters they had suffered. It left all present stunned and numb with astonishment. They voted to hold a meeting on the issue, but the young Scipio, destined by fate to be the leader in this war, declared that it was not a matter for discussion. In such a crisis, they needed courage and action, not deliberation, he said, and those who wanted the state out of harm should immediately take up their weapons and go with him. No camp is more truly an enemy camp than one that harbors plans like this within it, he added. With a few following him, Scipio then made for Metellus' quarters, and there came upon the young man of whom he had been informed, holding a meeting. With his sword drawn over their heads as they conferred, he exclaimed, "On my sacred oath I swear that I myself shall not abandon the republic of the Roman people, nor will I allow any other Roman citizen to do so. If I knowingly break my oath, then Jupiter, Optimus, Maximus, visit the most terrible destruction on my home, my family, and my possessions. Lucius, Caecilius, I demand that you and the rest of you here present take an oath using these words of mine. Anyone not swearing, let him know that this sword is drawn against him." They were as frightened as if they were looking upon the victorious Hannibal. They all took the oath and put themselves under Scipio's charge. 54. At the same time as these events were taking place in Canusium, some 4,500 infantry and cavalry, who had scattered in flight over the countryside, came to the consul in Venusia. The people of Venusia assigned all of them to various households. There they were to be given a warm welcome and looked after. The townspeople also gave each cavalryman a toga, a tunic, and 25 quadrigradi, and each infantryman 10 quadrigradi, and such arms as he was lacking. In all other respects, too, the treatment they received was hospitable on both the official and personal level, and every effort was made to ensure that the people of Venusia were not surpassed in acts of kindness by the lady of Canusium. In fact, the large numbers of refugees were proving too onerous a burden for Buza. The total had now reached close to 10,000 men. When Appius and Scipio were told that the other consul had survived the battle, they immediately sent him a message to report on their infantry and cavalry strength, and to ask whether his instructions were for their army to be brought to Venusia or to remain at Canusium. Varro actually led his own troops to Canusium, and there was now some semblance of a consular army, and it looked as if they would at least be able to defend themselves behind their fortifications, though not in open battle. The report that had been brought to Rome made no mention of the survival even of these remnants of citizens and allied troops. There it had been reported that the army and its leaders were completely annihilated, their forces totally wiped out. At no time ever was there such panic and uproar within the walls of Rome while the city was still safe. My abilities will not meet the task, and I shall not attempt a description which, whatever details I record, will fall short of the truth. A consul and his army had been lost at Trasimene the year before, and now it was not a case of the blow being followed by another blow, but by a disaster many times greater. 2 consular armies, along the 2 consuls, were reported lost. They were left with no Roman camp, no commander, no common soldier. Apulia, Samnium, and practically all of Italy were in Hannibal's hands. There is surely no other nation that would not have been crushed by such an overwhelming disaster. One might think of comparing the defeat of the Carthaginians in the sea battle of the Agates Islands, which crushed their resolve, and made them abandon Sicily and Sardinia, and accept tax-paying and tributary status. Or perhaps one might think of the defeat in Africa, later sustained by Hannibal himself. These disasters can in no respect be compared with Cannae, except to say that they were borne with less strength of character than the Romans bore theirs. 55. The praetors Publius Furius Philus and Marcus Pomponius summoned the Senate to the Curia Hostilia to discuss defensive measures for the city. They were in no doubt that, following the destruction of the armies, the enemy would advance to assault Rome, which was all that remained for him to do in the war. They faced a situation that was critical, but on which intelligence was lacking, and they could not come up with a plan to meet it. Meanwhile, ears were ringing with the noisy lamentations of women, while in almost every house, with the truth not yet known, mourning went on for the living and the dead alike. At this point, Quintus Fabius Maximus proposed sending some light cavalry along the Appian and Latin ways. These men would make inquiries of those whom he met. Some were sure to be soldiers who had scattered after the route, and report back on what had befallen the consuls and their armies. Also, if the immortal gods had shown pity on their empire and allowed some Romans to survive, they were to report on where those forces were located. They were to bring word, too, of where Hannibal had gone after the battle, what his plans were, what he was then doing, and what he was likely to do. Active young men should be used for searching out and retrieving this information, said Fabius, and the senators, meanwhile, had jobs to do. Given the shortage of magistrates, they had to suppress any public disturbance or panic. They had to keep women from appearing in public, compel them all to remain within their homes, and place restrictions on family mourning. They should impose citywide silence and see that bearers of any news were brought before the praetors. People were to post sentinels at the gates to stop anyone from leaving the city, and thus force people to see that their only hope lay in preserving the city and its defenses. Fabius concluded by saying that when the unrest died down, the senators should be recalled to the house, and defensive measures for the city should then be brought up for discussion. 56. There was unanimous support for this proposal without debate. The crowds were removed from the forum by the magistrates, and the senators went off in different directions to quell the disturbance. Then, finally, a letter arrived from the consul Gaius Terentius with the report of the death of the consul Lucius Aemilius and the destruction of his army. Varro added that he was then at Canusium, attempting to bring together, as if from a shipwreck, the remnants of the catastrophic defeat. He had about 10,000 men with him, he said, in no order and unassigned to companies, and the Carthaginian displaying neither the spirit of a victor nor the behavior of a great leader, was ensconced at Cannae, haggling over prisoners' ransoms and other plunder. Personal losses were then made known from house to house, and so overwhelmed with grief was the whole city that the annual rites of Ceres were suspended. There was a religious interdiction against participation in the ceremony by people in mourning, and at that time there was no married woman left untouched by bereavement. So to prevent other rites, whether state-sponsored or private, being abandoned for some same reason, a 30-day limit was imposed on the period of mourning by senatorial decree. When the unrest settled down in the city, the senators were recalled to the house. A further letter was now delivered, this time from the propraetor Titus Ottacilius in Sicily. Ottacilius reported that the kingdom of Hiero was being laid waste by a Punic fleet. He wished to respond to Hiero's appeals for help, but he had received a report that a second fleet equipped and ready for action was anchored off the Aegates Islands. For he explained the Carthaginian plan was to launch an immediate attack on Lilybaeum and other parts of the Roman province. When they became aware that Ottacilius had turned to the defense of the Syracusan coastline, a fleet was therefore necessary if the senators wished to protect Sicily and the allied king. 57. The letters from the consul and the praetor were read out, and the senators took the following decision. The praetor Marcus Claudius, commander of the fleet lying off Ostia, was to be sent to the army at Canusium. The consul was then to be given written orders to turn his army over to the praetor and come to Rome at the earliest possible opportunity that was consistent with the interests of the state. These terrible disasters aside, the Romans were also alarmed by a number of prodigies, especially the conviction that year of 2 Vestals, Opimia, and Floronia on charges of sexual misconduct. One had received the traditional penalty of being buried alive near the Porta Collina, and the other had committed suicide. The man guilty of the misconduct with Floronia, Lucius Cantilius, was the secretary of a pontiff, one of those officers that are these days called minor pontiffs, and he was so badly flogged in the comitium at the orders of the Pontifex Maximus that he expired under the lash. Occurring, as it did along with all the other misfortunes, this piece of sacrilege was naturally interpreted as a portent, and the decemvirs were therefore instructed to consult the books. Quintus Fabius Pictor was also sent to the oracle at Delphi to ask what prayers and acts of supplication they could employ to appease the gods, and further inquire when the Romans could see an end to their great disasters. Meanwhile, a number of outlandish sacrifices were conducted on instructions from the books of fate. These included a Gallic man and woman and a Greek man and woman being interred alive in the Forum Boarium, in a spot enclosed with stones which had already been the scene of this very un-Roman practice of human sacrifice. When, in the opinion of the decemvirs, enough had been done to placate the gods, Marcus Claudius Marcellus sent 1,500 men from Ostia to Rome for the defense of the city. These were men whom he had under his command as recruits for the fleet. A few days later he sent ahead to Tinum Sidicinum, the naval legion, that is, the third legion, under its military tribunes, and he transferred command of the fleet to his colleague Publius Furius Philus. A few days later, Marcellus himself hurried by forced marches to Canusium. At this point, Marcus Junius, who had been named dictator by the authority of the Senate, and the master of horse, Tiberius Sempronius, held a troop levy and recruited younger men who were 17 or over, and some who were still wearing the praextexta. From these were constituted a force of 4 legions and 1,000 cavalry. The 2 men also sent instructions to the allies and those of Latin status for troops to be supplied to them, as prescribed by the treaty. They issued orders for the preparation of armor, weaponry, and other equipment, and removed old enemy spoils that had been hanging in the temples and porticos. There was also a novel form of recruitment occasioned by the shortage of free men, and by the crisis they bought and armed, at state expense, 8,000 sturdy young men from the slave population, asking them first on an individual basis if they were willing to serve. Such soldiers were preferred even though the Romans had the chance of ransoming their captives at a lower price. 58. Following his enormously successful engagement at Cannae, Hannibal had busied himself with affairs that were more properly the concern of a victor than a soldier still at war. He brought forth the prisoners and separated them into groups. As earlier, at the Trebia and Lake Trasimene, he had kind words for the allies, whom he once again released. As earlier at the Trebia and Lake Trasimene, he had kind words for the allies, whom he once again released without ransom. But he also did something he had never done before. He summoned the Romans and addressed them in gentle terms. His war with the Romans was not a fight to the death, but a struggle for honor and power, he told them, as his ancestors had capitulated before the valor of Rome. So his goal now was to see others in turn capitulating before his success and valor. Accordingly, he concluded he was giving the prisoners the opportunity of ransoming themselves. The price would be 500 quadrigati per cavalryman, 300 per infantryman, and 100 per slave. This was a considerable increase in the price for the cavalrymen that they had negotiated on their surrender, but they gladly accepted any condition that would lead to a settlement. It was decided that 10 spokesmen should be elected by them to go to the Senate in Rome, and the only guarantee taken from these was their word that they would return. A Carthaginian nobleman, Cartholo, was sent along with them. He was to offer the terms if the Romans inclined towards a peace. After leaving the camp, one of the spokesmen, a person of truly un-Roman character, pretended he had forgotten something and returned to it simply to discharge the oath. He then caught up with his companions before nightfall. When the news reached Rome that the men were on their way, a lictor was sent to meet Cartholo and inform him, in the name of the dictator, that he was to leave Roman territory before dark. The prisoners' spokesmen were granted an audience with the Senate by the dictator. Their leader then spoke as follows: Marcus, Junius, and members of the Senate, none of us is aware that no community has ever put less value on prisoners of war than ours. Even so, unless we have undue confidence in our cause, no other men have ever been less deserving of your neglect after falling into the hands of the enemy. For we did not surrender our arms from cowardice in the field of battle. No, we carried on the battle till almost nightfall, standing on the mounds of our dead, before we fell back to our camp. For the rest of the day and the night that followed, we defended our rampart, exhausted though we were from our efforts and our wounds. We were surrounded and cut off from water by a victorious army with no prospect of breaking through the dense enemy lines, and after 50,000 men of our army had been slaughtered, we thought it was no crime for a few Roman soldiers to survive the Battle of Cannae. So the next day we finally negotiated a price for our ransom and release, and surrendered to the enemy the weapons that could help us no more. We had also been told that our ancestors secured their release from the Gauls by a ransom paid in gold, and that your own fathers, very much opposed to the peace terms, though they were nevertheless sent representatives to Tarentum to ransom prisoners of war. And this despite the fact that both battles, at the Allia with the Gauls and at Heraclea with Pyrrhus, were notorious less for the losses incurred than the cowardly flight of our side. The plains of Cannae are covered with mounds of Roman corpses, and we survived the battle for one reason only: the enemy ran out of weapons and strength in cutting us down. Moreover, there are in our number some who were not even involved in the pitched battle. Left to defend the camp, they simply fell into the enemy's hands when the camp was surrendered. Now I begrudge none of my fellow citizens or comrades in arms his good fortune or his circumstances, nor would I wish to promote myself by discrediting another. But consider those men, the ones who ran from the field, most of them without weapons, and did not stop until they reached Venusia or Canusium. Unless it is a question of some prize for being fleet of foot and for racing, even they have no right to set themselves above us and pride themselves on being better defenders of the Republic. But you will find them good and valiant soldiers, and us too. You will find even more ready to fight for our country, simply because we shall have been ransomed and restored to our fatherland through your generosity. You are recruiting troops of all ages and from every level of society. I am told that 8,000 slaves are being put under arms. Our number is no smaller than that, nor is the cost of our ransom greater than their buying price. Cost, I compare, for comparing ourselves with those people would mean my insulting the Roman name. This point, too, I would think you ought to take into account in considering such a question. Suppose you should lean towards harshness, though we have done nothing to deserve it. Think of the kind of enemy to whom you will be abandoning us. It is to a Pyrrhus, perhaps, who treated his prisoners like guests. Or is it to a barbarian and a Carthaginian to boot? And whether the man's greed or his callousness is the greater is hard to say. Could you but set eyes on the chains on your fellow citizens and their squalor and filthy state, that sight would certainly move you no less than the view of your legions strewn over the fields of Cannae. You can see the anxiety and tears of our relatives as they stand at the entrance to the Senate House awaiting your response. When these feel such anguish and worry for us and for those who are not here, what do you think are the feelings of the actual men whose lives and freedom now hang in the balance? Suppose, but some chance there is of that, for God's sake, that Hannibal should, contrary to his nature, show mercy on us. We should none the less think it not worthwhile to have our lives, since in your eyes we are not worth ransoming. Captives released without payment by Pyrrhus once returned to Rome, but they returned with ambassadors leading men to the state who had been sent to ransom them. Am I to return to my fatherland a citizen not worth the payment of 300 coins? Everyone has his own opinions, senators. I know that my life and my personal safety are in jeopardy, but the risk to my reputation concerns me more. I fear that we may leave here condemned and rejected, for people will not believe that it was the cost of the ransom that worried you. "60. When he finished speaking, a tearful wail immediately went up from the crowd in the comitium. People stretched out their hands to the Senate House, begging the senators to restore their children, their brothers, and their relatives to them. Fear and the dire situation had also brought women to join the crowd of men in the forum. The Senate was cleared of unauthorized personnel, and the debate began. Various opinions were put forward. Some advocated ransom of the prisoners at state expense. Others wanted no public expenditure, but said that ransoms paid from private sources should not be disallowed, and any currently lacking immediate funds should be given treasury loans, with the state protected by guarantors with collateral. Then Titus Manlius Torquatus, generally regarded as a man who was old-fashioned and too inflexibly austere, was asked his opinion, and he is reported to have spoken as follows. In the request of the spokesman had been limited to the ransom, If the request of the spokesman had been limited to the ransom of those who are in the hands of the enemy, I could have presented my view briefly without criticizing any of them. All you would have needed to be told was that you should maintain the tradition passed on by your fathers by now providing an example that is vital for military discipline. As matters stand, however, these men have practically boasted about their capitulation to the enemy. They have also expressed the opinion that they should be seen as superior not only to the men captured in battle by the enemy, but also to those who reached Venusia and Canusium, and even to the consul Gaius Terentius himself. And so, members of the Senate, I shall not allow you to remain unaware of what went on over there. I only wish that the comments I shall make before you were actually being made before the army at Canusium, for that army is the best witness to acts of cowardice and bravery by each of its members. Or, at least, I wish that one man were here, Publius Sempronius. If those fellows had followed Sempronius's lead, they would today be soldiers in a Roman camp instead of prisoners of war in enemy hands. But no. The enemy had, on their side too, mostly retired to their camp, exhausted from fighting and exulting their victory. Thus these men had the opportunity provided by the darkness to break out, and it was quite possible for 7,000 men in arms to break through even a dense enemy force. But they made no effort to do so themselves, and were unwilling to follow another. Publius Sempronius Tuditanus spent practically the whole night admonishing them and encouraging them to follow his lead, while enemy numbers were sparse around the camp, while all was still and quiet, and while darkness could provide cover for the operation. He told them that they could reach a safe haven and allied cities before dawn. Suppose Sempronius had said what the military tribune Publius Decius said at Samnium in our grandfather's time, and what in our youth Calpurnius Flamma said to 300 volunteers in the earlier Punic War, when he was leading a charge to take a hill situated in the enemy's midst. Men, let us die, and by our deaths raise the siege in which our legions are caught, was what they said. If those had been Publius Sempronius's words, he would have considered you to be not even men, and certainly not Romans, if none of you had stepped forward to share that act of valor. In fact, it was not the path of glory Sempronius was pointing out to you as much as the one leading to safety. He was bringing you home to your parents, your wives, and your children. You lacked the courage even to save yourselves. What would you have done if you had had to die for your country? 50,000 of your fellow citizens and allies lay cut to pieces around you that very day. If all those examples of courage make no impression on you, then nothing will. If a disaster of such magnitude did not make you hold life cheap, nothing will. You must long for your country while you are still free, with your rights intact, or rather while it is still your country, and while you are still its citizens. Your longing for it now comes too late. You have lost your status, forfeited your rights as citizens, become slaves of the Carthaginians. Is payment to be made for you to return to the position you gave up through your scandalous cowardice? Your countryman, Publius Sempronius, told you to take up your arms and follow him, and you did not listen. But you did listen to Hannibal shortly afterwards, when he told you to betray your camp and surrender your weapons. But why am I accusing those people of cowardice, when I can accuse them of a criminal act? Not simply refusing to follow a man who gave them sound advice, they actually tried to impede him and hold him back. Only some courageous men drew their swords and pushed the cowards aside. I tell you, Publius Sempronius had to break through a column of his countrymen before breaking through the enemy column. Will our country miss citizens like this? Had the others been like that, she would today have not one citizen of all those who fought at Cannae. Of a total of 7,000 soldiers, there were 600 who had the pluck to make a sortie, who returned to their native land free and still under arms, and these 600 met no resistance from the enemy. How safe a passage do you think a column made up of almost 2 legions would have had? Members of the Senate, you would have in service today at Canusium 20,000 brave and loyal soldiers. As matters stand, though, how can these men be good and loyal citizens? For brave is not a word even they would use of themselves, unless one can really believe that they were helping their comrades with the sortie, when in fact they tried to impede them, or unless one can believe they do not look with jealousy on their comrades' safety and the renown they earned by their valor, when they know that it was their own fear and cowardice that brought about their own degrading captivity. They preferred to skulk in their tents, awaiting the arrival of dawn and the enemy along with it, though they had the chance to break out when all was quiet at night. But perhaps you think that, though they lacked the spirit to make the break, they still had the courage to put up a bold defense of the camp. Perhaps they spent a number of days under siege, protecting their rampart with their arms, and protecting themselves with their rampart. Perhaps it was only after a last-ditch effort and extreme suffering, only after running out of everything that sustains life, and after they were no longer able to hold their weapons, their strength sapped by hunger, only then were they overcome, and by the constraints of the human condition rather than by the enemy. But no. At sunrise the enemy approached the rampart. Before the second hour of the day, without risking any engagement, these men surrendered their weapons and themselves. This, you see, was the extent of these men's military action over the 2-day period. Honor called for them to stand in the battle line and fight. They ran back to camp. They should have fought for their rampart. They surrendered the camp. Neither in the field of battle nor in the camp did they show themselves to be of any worth. And we are supposed to ransom you? When you should force your way out of camp, you hang back and stay there. When you are required to stay and defend the camp by force of arms, you surrender camp, weapons, and yourselves to the enemy. For my part, members of the Senate, I do not recommend ransoming those people any more than I would recommend surrendering to Hannibal the men who made the sortie from the camp through the midst of the enemy, and who, by their supreme courage, restored themselves to their country. (61) Most of the senators also had relatives amongst the prisoners, but after Manlius' address, they were concerned not only about the precedent. From early days, the state had shown little regard for prisoners of war, but also about the amount of money involved. They did not wish to see the treasury depleted, for they had already spent a large sum on buying and equipping the slaves for service, and they also did not want any improvement in the finances of Hannibal, who, rumor had it, was particularly deficient in this respect. The delegates were given the grim reply that the prisoners were not to be ransomed. Fresh anguish was now added to the old over the sacrifice of so many citizens, and it was with flowing tears and lamentation that the people accompanied the delegates to the gate. One of these went off home, claiming he had fulfilled the obligation of the oath by his ploy of returning to the camp. When this became known, and word of it reached the Senate, the senators unanimously voted that the man be arrested and taken back to Hannibal with an official escort. There is another version of the story of the prisoners. According to this, the 10 men came first, and some doubts were expressed in the Senate over whether or not they should be allowed into the city. They were admitted, but only on condition that they not be granted a senatorial audience. Then, since they were away longer than anyone expected, 3 further delegates appeared on the scene: Lucius Scribonius, Gaius Calpurnius, and Lucius Manlius. It was at this point that the motion for the ransoming of the prisoners was finally put to the Senate by a plebeian tribune who was related to Scribonius, and the Senate voted against the ransom. The 3 recently arrived delegates then returned to Hannibal, but the 10 earlier ones remained behind. These had, they claimed, fulfilled their religious obligations because after starting their journey they had gone back to Hannibal on the pretext of checking the prisoners' names. The question of surrendering these was discussed with great acrimony in the Senate, and those who favored surrendering them were defeated by only a few votes. Under the next censors, however, the men were subjected to all manner of criticism and humiliation, so much so that some immediately committed suicide, and the others spent the rest of their lives not only avoiding the forum, but virtually avoiding daylight and public areas. One can easily express surprise at the discrepancy between these accounts. Less easy is telling where the truth lies. How much greater this defeat was than earlier ones is indicated by the following. To that day the loyalty of the Allies had remained unshaken, but now it began to waver, and the sole reason for that was surely the loss of faith in the empire. The following peoples defected to the Carthaginians: the Atellani, the Calatini, the Hirpini, some of the Apulians, the Samnites apart from the Pentri, all the Bruti, and the Lucanians. In addition to these, there were also the Uzentini, practically all the Greeks on the coast, the peoples of Tarentum, Metapontum, Croton, and Lucre, and all the Cisalpine Gauls. And yet these defeats and allied defections prompted no talk of peace anywhere amongst the Romans, neither before the consul's arrival in Rome nor after his return, which brought back to mind the disaster they had suffered. Such was the strength of character of the citizenry at that very time, that on the return of the consul from the debacle for which he was primarily responsible, people of all classes streamed out to meet him, and thanked him for not having lost confidence in the Republic. Had he been a Carthaginian leader, there is no manner of punishment that he would not have faced. End of Book 22.